Paul draws Georgie from the couch and covers the boy's head in a pillowcase. He then asks George to ask Anne to remove her dress to prove she has a toned body. The movie begins with a typical wealthy family going to their vacation house. Anne battles against George, her husband, inside the vehicle, in a guessing game about classical music playing in the speaker. It rotates until George stops the car in front of Thompson's house. Eve and Thompson are neighbors, and two unfamiliar men accompany them on the front lawn, Paul and Steve. Anne rolls down the window, shouting teasingly at the couple for being unfair for practicing golf before their competition tomorrow. The Thompsons remain silent until Steve approaches Fred, and he finally replies. Anne brushes off the sudden coldness and invites the Thompsons to assemble the boat to sail, but Fred answers reluctantly. After the encounter, George returns to driving. Anne notices something amiss from their neighbors since her friend ignores them. Their son Georgie asks about Jenny Thompson since she's not outside. Anne thinks Jenny must be in another place. The family finally reaches their summer house. Their dog Lucky, Georgie, and Anne enter first with chores on hand, and Lucky is noisy and snoopy as usual. George then enters and places the bags of golf clubs aside. Anne asks for the meat in the car since she organizes the ration. George brings Lucky outside and sees their neighbor Fred with Paul behind the gate. Lucky barks persistently solely at Paul as they approach. George apologizes for Lucky's sudden noisiness, but Fred openly accepts and introduces Paul as the son of his business associate. Then, Anne comes out to welcome the guests and gives Fred a peck on the cheek. Afterward, the boys go to the bay to push the boat onto the water. Fred leaves the rest of the work to the fatherson. Georgie is upset because Jenny's a no-show, and George creates an excuse that she may be in a friend's house. Georgie shares his observation, like Anne's, about Fred's unusual acts. As for Anne, she prepares dinner while on the phone. Georgie appears midway and asks for a knife. Anne gives the knife and expects him to return it. Georgie leaves but returns again, announcing that someone's at the door. Georgie joins George, and Steve introduces him as the other guy in Thompson's house. Steve smiles shyly and stops whenever he calls the Thompsons on a first-name basis. Anne, raising suspicion, asks how he got in, and he explains he entered through the fence, which is technically trespassing. Despite the red flags, Anne still acts nice and gives the eggs. He grabs them carefully and is about to leave when the eggs fall on the floor. Anne sees the mess, quickly cleans it up, and dismisses Steve's apologies. Anne's no longer interested in providing, but Steve still asks for more. Anne's impatience gradually grows, but she forces herself to be kind, giving the eggs in a carton this time. Remember, hiding personal belongings is proper when a stranger is inside a home. As Anne forgets her phone near the sink, Steve purposely drops it on the water and pretends it's because he's clumsy. Anne quickly packs the eggs just for Steve to leave immediately. Outside, Lucky barks whenever the two strangers are around since he senses something wrong while the family's clueless. Anne finds Paul and Steve inside the house again because Lucky terrifies them. Anne stops Lucky from his instincts and lets the men explain. Paul suspiciously surveys the house while Steve stalls time. Paul strategically diverts his attention to the golf clubs and asks permission to try one. Anne should have caged Lucky regarding Steve's fear and imposed her authority on the house to insist. On the bay, Georgie on the boat listens to Lucky's yapping, wondering what's wrong. The barking fades, Lucky yelps his last wail, and everything goes silent. George leaves the boat to search for Lucky, and Anne does the same. When Anne reaches the back lawn, Paul interferes with her by saying the golf club makes the gameplay different. Anne comes to her senses and realizes the two men are troublesome. She asks them to leave the house immediately because they make her uncomfortable. But with his emotional manipulation tactics, Paul deflects the real issue and belittles Anne's feelings. They keep asking about Anne's shift in attitude. According to Paul, George walks in with Georgie to ask about Lucky but finds himself amidst a misunderstanding. Paul gets the upper hand to use George's ignorance and twists the story. Anne grabs Paul's arm to leave, but George, the epitome of an idiotic and doubtful husband, still lets them remain. Anne gives up and allows her husband to handle the conversation. He politely asks them to leave, but Paul insists on the eggs, which George no longer intends to give. Paul says, "Provide the eggs," and it's not even hard to understand. However, this frustrates George. He slaps Paul's face and asks them again to leave. The slap angers Steve, who snatches a golf club and firmly strikes George's left knee. George falls and groans in agony. Georgie lunges with a shriek to Steve's chest and starts hitting ferociously. Paul pulls Georgie, lays him beside George, and asks him to behave. Georgie runs to her mother's embrace as Anne enters the room and sees George in pain. Paul reasons George deserves the pain since he slapped him. The nightmare of funny games begins with Paul's first game. He brings out a golf ball to let the family guess the item. He rolls it on the floor and asks why he still has it. Steve answers it's because he didn't use it in the first place. A realization strikes Anne. Paul used the club to beat Lucky to death by using the club. And for them to find Lucky, they let him walk to places. If he says it's cold, she's far from Lucky. If it's warm, she's near. Anne follows his words, goes behind the van's trunk, and opens it. Lucky falls open on the ground, mercilessly beaten. Anne's close friends, Betsy and Robert, visit the family with their boat on the docks. Anne reluctantly welcomes them because Paul is watching her. They chat about various things while being oblivious that Anne is in a helpless situation. Eventually, her friends leave after an exchange of pleasantries. Inside, Anne bluffs about their friends coming over while they relocate to another room. George, who depends on Anne's strength to move, grunts and endures Steve's pain and nonsensical blabber of Steve about openness to solving things. The family is held hostage by two demented men who enjoy masochistic entertainment. Paul and Steve continuously torture the family with faux niceties and pretend they did nothing wrong. Anne lays George onto the couch and leaves to gather medicine. While she's away, Paul expresses his disappointment whenever people act unfriendly. Regardless, he apologizes for their unruly action and introduces himself again along with Steve. Steve extends a hand, but Anne barges in with the medicine. Paul becomes furious at Anne's interruption and pushes her directly to George's wound. George yells in pain, and Anne stands to charge against Paul. However, Steve handles the mess and heavily kicks George's injury twice. George still hasn't recovered from the previous pain and sits in discomfort. While Paul punches Anne in the stomach, who bellows a cry and pushes her beside George, Georgie cries at his beaten parents. Paul quickly tackles him on the ground and shouts to calm down. After the fiasco, everyone quietly settles down. The tiredness and fear transpire on the family's faces and tremble in the two men's unpredictability. George shakingly asks their purpose. Paul replies that he and Steve are drug addicts who rob affluent families in their vacation houses to support their lifestyles. George shouts, he understands but wonders why the need for violence. Paul responds that they enjoy the display of agony. Then, Paul offers a bet: the family will meet their demise in 12 hours. As for the family, they must bet they'll be alive until morning. The family does not intend to bet on a risky game, but Paul breaks the fourth wall and asks the viewers for their bets. George has had enough and willingly offers his wealth in exchange for freedom. He mentions how Eve and Fred will react if they learn of the two delinquents, but Paul mocks him instead and continues the deal. The next game they initiate is the cat in the bag. Paul draws Georgie from the couch and covers the boy's head in a pillowcase. He then asks George to ask Anne to remove her dress to prove she has a toned body. If she restrains, Paul chokes Georgie in the bag, which forces Anne to strip down. Tears stream down her cheeks as she undresses. The strip show satisfies the two and instructs her to return to her clothes. Suddenly, Paul stands after realizing Georgie urinated on his pants. Anne tackles him as he removes the bag, giving Georgie an opening to escape upstairs to the balcony. Paul constrains Anne in tapes and follows Georgie outside. Outside, Georgie climbs their gate, but he recalls Jenny's house. He passes through the fence, on the water, and to their open house and hides inside. Steve confesses his degradation at home when he begs for the eggs and even checks if it's still intact. While he's away, Anne hops to George to remove her bounds. Alas, Steve returns in time to catch her escape. He rigidly drags her out and pushes her to the ground. The eggs fall to the ground from his arms, and Steve grunts in frustration. Anne kneels and begs him to let them go and that he's still young. She even proposes they'll lie about what happened, but Steve ignores it and comments it's degrading and painful to watch her plead. As for the hide and seek, Georgie disposes of his wet clothes to prevent wet marks and hides upstairs. Downstairs, Paul calls Georgie. Georgie, in the corner, finds a shotgun lying around and spots a corpse in the bathroom. He restrains the well of tears when he realizes it's Jenny's. Georgie takes the gun and runs away, locking himself in another room. Unfortunately, Paul finds him and even directs Georgie to use the weapon. Georgie's hands and face quiver from terror to the point he struggles to operate the gun. When he succeeds, he realizes he carries an unloaded gun. Meanwhile, Anne sits emotionlessly with teary eyes. The back door opens, and Paul imitates Georgie's speaking expression. Georgie rushes to Anne and tightly hugs her with tears streaming down his bluish face. He reports Paul and Steve killed Jenny. In contrast, Paul thanks Georgie for giving him a new weapon. The chase drains Paul, and he grabs food in the kitchen. While he collects food, heavy running footsteps emerge in the other room, and he dies after a gunshot blows out. Paul listens apathetically while the couple screams and sobs in rage. Paul enters the bloodied room and chides Steve for impulsiveness, which leaves the two men to depart the house because Steve shot someone who's not part of the game. The only ones left in the room are the couple and their son's corpse. Anne turns off the television and cuts the tape off with a knife. George lies feebly on the ground, sniffles his clogged nose, and cries to release the anger he bottled when he witnesses their son slain. Anne rushes to George and huddles together for their lost son. The couples plan to contact authorities, but George's phone is in the car. Anne's phone is useless as nothing occurs despite trying to dry it out. Anne limps to houses and idiotically screams for help. Ideally, no one cries when two mental men wander around the vicinity. Regrettably, while she seeks help, Paul and Steve see her on the road, capture Anne, and return her home with a gag on her mouth. This time, Paul calls it the second round. Things turn into a cruel twist. While Paul and Steve negotiate with the couple to keep the torture entertaining, they offer what to use between the knife and shotgun. Before they slaughter, Paul asks Anne to pray before they move to kill, but she knows none. So, he asks Steve, who only knows one. Paul commands Anne to say the prayer meaningfully, and she does it right on the second try. He then adds a handicap where Anne must pray it backward perfectly. However, Anne grabs the shotgun and shoots Steve. Paul screams, kicks Anne to the couch, and frantically searches for a remote. After Paul pushes a button, time rewinds to the time before Anne shot Steve. Paul knows the future, raises the gun first, and kills George on the floor. The movie ends with Anne, who's still a captive of the two in her boat. They sail to Anne's friend Betsy. During Steve chatters about dimensional theories, Anne uses the knife she lent to Georgie yesterday and quietly cuts the rope, but Paul spots her. Steve automatically grabs the knife and dumps it into the water. Paul withdraws Anne from her seat, kisses her forehead, and effortlessly pushes her overboard. The two reach their next victim, and Paul leads the plan. He knocks on the door. Betsy appears and uses the egg scheme, the same tactic they used for Anne's family. Then, he stares at the camera and smiles contentiously to find another clueless victim for their entertainment. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.